What Garrett Ashford didn't know, when he stood in my backyard and laughed at my calloused hands, was that the company financing his family's $3.8 million estate in Scottsdale had my last name on the letterhead. I want to tell you something before I get into all of it. I'm 63 years old. I came to this country from Sao Paulo when I was 19 with a duffel bag, $200, and an uncle who let me sleep on his couch in Newark for 4 months. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because you need to understand what kind of man I am before you understand what kind of man Garrett is, and why what happened between us was always going to end the way it did. My daughter's name is Isabel. She's 31. She has her mother's stubbornness and my eyes and the laugh that could fill a stadium. Her mother, my wife Renee, passed 11 years ago from pancreatic cancer. It was fast. We had 9 months from diagnosis to goodbye, and I spent every one of those months either at her bedside or in the garage, ugly crying into a shop rag so Isabel wouldn't hear. After Renee died, it was just the two of us. We learned how to cook together, badly at first. We watched old movies on Friday nights. We got through it. So when Isabel called me 2 years ago and said, "Dad, I want you to meet someone," I put on my good shirt and drove 40 minutes to the restaurant she picked, and I shook hands with Garrett Ashford with a genuine open heart. I wanted her to be happy. That's the only thing I ever wanted. Garrett was tall, good-looking in a catalog kind of way. His family was old Arizona money. His grandfather had made it in commercial real estate. His father had grown it, and Garrett had mostly maintained it while collecting a title at the family's property management firm that sounded more impressive than it probably was. He was polished, confident. He shook my hand firmly and looked me in the eye and said it was great to finally meet me, and I thought, okay, I can work with this. The cracks didn't show right away. They rarely do. The first time I noticed something was at Christmas that year. Isabel had invited me to the Ashford family holiday dinner at his parents' house, a 7,000-square-foot spread in North Scottsdale, with a courtyard fountain and a wine cellar. His mother mentioned 3 times in the first hour. His mother's name was Lorraine. His father was Clifton Ashford, a big man with a red face and a golfer's tan. They were perfectly cordial to me that evening. The way you are cordial to someone who has come to fix your internet. I told them I ran a commercial lending firm. Lorraine smiled and said, "Oh, how interesting," in a tone of voice people use when they mean the opposite. Clifton asked what kind of loans, and when I explained we specialized in mid-market real estate financing, developers, property groups, that kind of portfolio, he nodded slowly, the way you nod at something you've already decided doesn't concern you. After dinner, Garrett found me on the back patio where I'd stepped out for air. He was carrying 2 glasses of bourbon, and he handed me one, and for a moment I thought maybe I'd read the room wrong. Then he said, "You know, Isabel mentioned you started with basically nothing. That's admirable, really." He said it the way someone says really when they mean I suppose. I looked at him and said, "I still have basically nothing. I just built a lot of things with it." He laughed. I didn't. The next 18 months were a slow accumulation of small things that individually you could excuse and collectively you could not. Garrett commenting that Isabel's taste in vacations had gotten more adventurous since she started dating him, as if before him she'd been living in a cave. Garrett mentioning twice at separate dinners that his family had a connection at a prestigious firm where Isabel worked, and had she thought about how that might help her career, implying her position was something that needed help. Garrett referring to my neighborhood in Tempe, where I'd lived for 22 years, as cute. Isabel saw some of it. She'd call me after and say, "I'm sorry about tonight, Dad." And I'd say, "Nothing to be sorry about," because I didn't want to be the father who poisoned his daughter's relationship with his own resentment. That's a real thing that happens. I'd seen it. I kept my mouth shut, and I watched, and I waited to be wrong about him. I was not wrong about him. The engagement happened last April. Isabel was over the moon. She called me from the restaurant where he proposed, still crying happy tears. And I sat in my kitchen and I said everything a father is supposed to say, and I meant most of it. I was happy she was happy. I was less happy about who was making her happy, but I told myself, she's an adult, she's smart, she knows him better than you do. About 6 weeks after the engagement, Garrett called me. Not Isabel. Garrett, directly. He said he wanted to have lunch, just the two of us, to talk about wedding plans. I said fine, picked a place near my office. He was already seated when I arrived. He looked relaxed. He had that practiced ease of someone who has never had to wonder whether they were welcome in a room. We ordered, made small talk. Then he set his fork down and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as prepared. "I wanted to talk to you about the financial side of the wedding," he said. I said I was listening. "Our family is expecting something at a certain level," he said. "The venue Isabel likes, the hacienda, is running about 110 for a Saturday. Then there's catering, band, flowers, the whole thing. We're looking at somewhere between 220 and 250 all in." I nodded. I was doing math in my head. I said, "That's a significant event." "It is," he said, "and I think it's fair that costs get shared. Our family is prepared to cover half." He paused. "We're expecting your contribution to be around 110,000. I looked at him. I kept my face even. "And if I can't commit to that number?" He picked his fork back up, took a bite, chewed slowly. Then he said, "Then we'd have to look at a different kind of event, which would be disappointing for Isabel." There it was, dressed up in calm language and a business lunch. But there it was. Pay or your daughter gets a lesser wedding. Pay or disappoint her. Pay or admit what you are. I took a sip of water. I said, "Let me think about it." He smiled. He actually smiled. "Of course, take your time." I drove back to my office, and I sat at my desk for a long time. I need to explain something about what I do, because it matters. My company, Marlowe Capital Group, has been operating for 26 years. We're not a household name. We don't advertise. We work in a very specific lane: bridge loans, construction financing, and long-term commercial mortgages for mid-size real estate portfolios in the Southwest. Over the years, we've grown, not explosively, carefully, the way you grow something you built with your own hands and intend to keep. We currently hold or service around $400 million in active loans across Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. The Ashford family's real estate holdings, including the Scottsdale estate where Clifton and Lorraine lived and 3 commercial properties the family owned through a holding company called Ashford Pacific Group, had been financed through us for 9 years. Garrett had no idea. His parents had no idea. They had signed documents with Marlowe Capital Group on 8 separate occasions, and not once, apparently, had anyone in that family looked up who owned it. I have known since the second dinner I attended at their home. I recognized the address. I'd pulled the file that night just to confirm what I already suspected. I hadn't said anything. There was nothing to say at the time. Now there was something to say. But I am not a man who acts from anger. I am a man who acts from clarity. And so I did not pick up the phone that afternoon and call in the loans, or freeze the accounts, or do anything at all. I went home. I made myself dinner. I called Isabel and listened to her talk about centerpiece options for 20 minutes, and I slept on it. I slept on it for 3 weeks. What changed was a Sunday afternoon barbecue at Isabel's apartment, which Garrett's parents also attended. It was supposed to be casual. It was not casual. Lorraine arrived with a folder of wedding venue photos and a running commentary on every choice that had already been made. Clifton made 2 jokes. I was not meant to hear about Isabel's family situation. Once to Garrett, once to his brother-in-law, who I hadn't met before. Isabel was busy at the grill and didn't hear them. But I was standing 6 feet away by the cooler, and I heard both of them. I heard them clearly. I went inside to use the bathroom, and I stood at the sink for a moment with the water running. I looked at myself in the mirror. I thought about Renee, who used to say, "The problem with letting things go is sometimes they don't go, they just grow." I thought about 19-year-old me on a plane to Newark with $200 and a whole lot of stubborn optimism. I thought about what I had built and what it was worth, and what it apparently looked like to these people. Then I went back outside, got myself a burger, and sat in a lawn chair next to Isabel and told her the potato salad was excellent. On Monday morning I called my general counsel, a woman named Patricia. No, wait, I need to stop myself. Her name was Vera. Vera had been with Marlowe Capital for 14 years. I told her I wanted a full status review on the Ashford Pacific accounts. She had it on my desk by end of day. The estate had a mortgage with us, 22 years remaining, a balance of approximately $2.1 million. Not delinquent, never late, nothing to act on there. And I wasn't going to manufacture something. That's not who I am. But there was something else. Ashford Pacific had a construction loan with us, taken out 18 months prior for a mixed-use development in Chandler. They were in month 3 of a 12-month draw schedule. The loan covenanters, standard for that type of financing, included what's called a material adverse change clause. If something occurred that significantly altered the borrower's financial condition or business standing, we had the right to request additional security or, in certain circumstances, accelerate the loan. More relevantly, the construction loan had a personal guarantee from Clifton Ashford, and Clifton was a co-borrower on a smaller commercial mortgage, also through us, that had a clause allowing for review and renegotiation at the 5-year mark, which was coming up in 60 days. I was not going to do anything improper. I was not going to freeze accounts, which is not actually something a commercial lender can casually do anyway. I was not going to fabricate a default. What I was going to do was exercise every legitimate right I had at the exact moment it was most instructive. But first, I was going to have a conversation. I called Garrett on a Wednesday. I told him I'd thought about his proposal. He sounded pleased. I said I'd like to discuss it in person, and I'd like his parents to be there. He paused, then said he thought that could be arranged. We met the following Saturday at the Ashford house. Lorraine had put out a tray of cheeses. Clifton was in his usual chair. Garrett sat across from me looking composed, and I thought, he has done this before. The confident ask. The implied leverage. He has done this before. I sat down, took a glass of water, and I said I'd had a chance to think about the wedding contribution request. Before I respond to that, I want to make sure we all understand each other. Clifton said, of course, in his measured way. I said, I want to ask you something. The company that holds your construction loan in Chandler, do you know who owns it? Silence. I watched Lorraine look at Clifton. I watched Clifton's expression shift in a way that took about 3 seconds and covered a lot of ground. I said, Marlowe Capital Group. I founded it in 1998. I've been the majority owner for 26 years. Your family has been borrowing from my company for 9 years. Nobody said anything. I turned to Garrett. I said, when you looked at me and suggested I write a 6-figure check or accept a lesser wedding for my daughter, you were saying that to the man who holds your family's paper. I want you to know that I know that, and I want you to know that until this moment, I never once let it affect how I treated your family or how my company serviced your accounts. Garrett opened his mouth. I continued, I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to be clear. My company will conduct its standard 5-year review on your father's commercial mortgage, as specified in the agreement he signed. It will be thorough. Clifton, you should have your attorney review the personal guarantee on the Chandler loan before that review concludes. Not because I'm planning to act against your interests, but because you should always know what you've signed. I picked up the glass of water and drank from it, and I'm going to decline the contribution request. Isabel and I will be happy to host a beautiful wedding within a budget that I choose, not one that's handed to me as a condition. Lorraine said very quietly, we didn't know. I said, I know you didn't. That's actually the point. I stood up. I straightened my jacket. I said, I've always believed that the way you treat people when you think they have nothing tells you everything about who you are. You showed me who you are. I just wanted to make sure you knew who I was. I shook Clifton's hand, nodded to Lorraine, and walked to the front door. Garrett followed me into the entryway. His composure was gone. He looked younger without it. He said, what does this mean for Isabel? For us? I stopped at the door and I turned around and I looked at my daughter's fiancé and I said, that's a question for Isabel. And I'd suggest you answer it honestly because she deserves that. I drove home in the quiet of a September afternoon in Tempe, past the taco place I've been going to for 15 years, past the library where Isabel used to do her homework, past the neighborhood that Garrett once called cute. I put the windows down. The air smelled like creosote after rain. Isabel called me that night. She said, Dad, Garrett told me everything. He told me about the lunch, the 110,000, all of it. I said, okay. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, why didn't you tell me? I said, because it wasn't my conversation to have. It was his. She didn't say anything for a while. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, "He also told me about today, at his parents' house." Another pause. "He said you were incredibly calm." I said, "I had a lot of time to think." She laughed a little, just a little. Then she said, "Dad, I need to figure some things out." I said, "Take all the time you need, I'm not going anywhere." We stayed on the phone for another hour, not talking about Garrett, talking about other things, easy things, the way we'd learned to do after Renee died, when some nights the only way to get through was to talk about the grocery store and the neighbor's dog, and whether the Suns had a shot this season. We knew how to do that. We practiced. The Ashford family's attorney contacted Vera 3 weeks later requesting a courtesy extension on the 5-year review timeline. We granted it, standard professional courtesy. We would conduct the review fully and fairly, as we always had, and whatever the numbers said, the numbers would say. That's all. Garrett and Isabel did not get married. That's not something I engineered, and I want to be clear about that. Isabel made that decision herself over several weeks after several long conversations I was not part of. She told me later that the $110,000 demand had been the moment she started paying a different kind of attention, and that the more she paid attention, the more she saw things she hadn't let herself see before. I don't know all of what she saw. That's hers. What I know is that she called me on a Tuesday in November and said, "I ended it," in the flat, tired voice of someone who has been thinking hard for a long time. I said, "Are you okay?" She said, "I will be." I said, "Do you want me to come over?" She said, "Yeah." I drove to her apartment, and I brought a rotisserie chicken from the grocery store, the thing I always brought when she was a teenager having a bad day, and she laughed when she saw it, that big stadium laugh, and we sat at her kitchen table and ate chicken and talked until almost midnight. She asked me at one point whether I had used the loans as leverage intentionally, whether the whole visit to the Ashford house had been about force. I thought about that. I said, "I used the truth. I didn't make up anything. I didn't manufacture a default. I didn't threaten anything improper. I just made sure they knew who they were talking to. And then I let everyone make their own choices." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Mom would have found that very satisfying." I said, "I know. I thought about her the whole time. There's a version of this story where I'm the villain, I understand that. A man with financial power using a family's debt as a backdrop for a confrontation. I've thought about that version. I don't think it's accurate, but I understand why someone might tell it that way. What I know is what I did and what I didn't do. I didn't call in any loans. I didn't manufacture a cause. I didn't try to financially ruin anyone. I walked into a room and told the truth about who I was to people who'd decided who I was without asking, and I let them sit with that, if the knowledge that they had borrowed 9 years of money from the man they'd been dismissing was uncomfortable. That discomfort was their own doing. I've been in this country 44 years. I've been working for 44 years. I built something real out of real work, and I kept it quiet because I was taught that a man's worth isn't in what he announces. My father told me that in Portuguese when I was 8 years old, in a kitchen in Sao Paulo that smelled like coffee and rain, and I have never once forgotten it. Garrett Ashford looked at me and saw a man who wasn't worth the trouble of basic respect. I don't think he was unusual in that. I think a lot of people do a version of that every day, decide who matters and who doesn't, based on whatever surface they can see. I'm not angry about it anymore. I'm not sure I was ever really angry. What I felt mostly was a kind of tired sadness, the kind that comes from knowing this is just how some people are. But I'm also my father's son, and my father's son doesn't apologize for what he built. Isabel is doing well. She got a promotion at work 4 months ago on her own without any family connection from anyone. She calls me on Sunday mornings, and sometimes we drive out to the desert and walk the trails we used to walk when she was a teenager, and we needed to not talk about something. The Sonoran Desert in early morning before the heat comes is one of the most quietly beautiful things I know. I try to explain it to people who haven't been here. I never quite get it right. She asked me once, on one of those walks, whether I thought she'd find someone. I said, yes. She said, "You sound very sure." I said, "You're your mother's daughter. Men fall in love with your mother's daughters." She rolled her eyes. but she was smiling, and we kept walking, and the sun came up over the ridge the way it does out there, sudden and warm and unambiguous, like it was never going to do anything other than rise. I've been thinking lately about what my father used to say when I was a boy, that the choices you make when no one is watching are the only ones that really count. He said it in a small kitchen in Sao Paulo in Portuguese, over bad coffee, and I've carried it across 2 countries and 44 years of work, and I think it's still the truest thing I know. What happened with Garrett and his family was not complicated when I strip it down to its bones. A man decided I wasn't worth his basic respect. He made that decision based on what he could see, my neighborhood, my calloused hands, my accent when I'm tired. And he acted on it. That's a choice. Every choice like that sets something in motion, and what it sets in motion doesn't stop just because you stop paying attention. I didn't ruin that family. I walked into a room and told the truth. The discomfort they felt afterward came entirely from the gap between how they had behaved and what was actually true. That gap was their own making, not mine. But I want to be honest about what got me to that room, because I think it matters. It wasn't anger. Anger would have had me on the phone the week after that lunch, doing something reckless, something I'd have regretted. What got me there was something quieter, a kind of long, patient clarity that I had to earn the hard way, over decades of being underestimated and choosing not to let it make me small. I think about the 19-year-old version of me landing in Newark with nothing but a bag and a stubborn refusal to accept that the version of myself other people imagined was the only version available. That kid had no wisdom. He had no resources. What he had was the willingness to keep going when it would have been easier to stop, and the basic integrity not to cut corners just because corners were available to cut. Those 2 things, held on to long enough, become something. I don't know what to call it exactly. Character, maybe. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. What I saw in Garrett was the opposite of that. He had been handed advantage, and he had used it to avoid the kind of growth that only difficulty produces. He had never had to build anything from nothing. So he didn't know how to recognize it when he was standing in front of it. That's not cruelty on his part. It's just a particular kind of blindness that comfort can cause if you let it. Isabel understood something, in the weeks after everything came apart, that I hadn't expected her to understand so quickly. She said she had confused confidence for character, that Garrett's ease in every room had looked like security and turned out to be something else. A man who had never been tested, performing the idea of a man who had. I thought that was a remarkable thing to see clearly, and a hard thing, and I was proud of her for seeing it. What I hope she carries forward is this, that the work of becoming a person worth trusting, honest under pressure, clear-eyed about what things cost, willing to stand in an uncomfortable room and tell the truth quietly, that work doesn't happen in good times. It happens in the moments when it would be easier to look away. Garrett looked away from himself for a long time. Isabel stopped looking away. I don't know if he'll figure it out eventually. I hope he does. That's not sentiment. It's just that a person who never learns to see past the surface of things is going to have a long, hollow life, and I don't wish that on anyone. The desert was beautiful this morning. I drove out before 6 before the heat, and I walked for an hour in the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. I thought about Renee. I thought about Isabel. I thought about the small kitchen in Sao Paulo and the $200 and the couch in Newark. All of it connected, all of it leading somewhere I couldn't have mapped from the beginning. That's the thing about playing a long game honestly. You don't always know what you're building. You just keep building it right.